Chapter 1. The Ogre at the Gates. The rain came down in dirty sheets, a cold slop that matted hair, soaked cloaks, and turned the roads of Dregmouth into fetid sludge. The old port town crouched on the coastline like a rotting corpse, its crumbling stone walls streaked with moss and piss. Seagulls screamed overhead, not in greeting, but warning. A heavy mist clung to the outskirts like a shroud, parting only as something vast moved through it. The gates of Dregmouth creaked and groaned as guards scrambled along the battlements, peering into the fog with narrowed eyes and crossbows drawn. Through the soupy mist a shape loomed. A hulking silhouette, massive, broad-shouldered, dragging something long and jagged behind it. Horses whinnied nervously behind the gate. The guards shifted. Then the fog opened, and Grogmaw stepped through. 7 feet of weather-worn ogre muscle trudged toward the gates, each footfall a heavy thump in the mud. His armor was a patchwork of blood-stained plates, furs soaked and hanging like dead things from his belt. His gut plate, scratched with crude runes, was pocked and blackened from old fire. In one hand he carried a hooked spear taller than a man. Slung across his back, a cleaver the size of a coffin door. Rain rolled off his bald scalp and down his thick brow, trickling past a face like chiseled granite, scarred, impassive, cold-eyed. He did not roar, he did not demand, he simply walked forward. A young guard atop the gatehouse gasped. "Sigmar's bloody mercy, what is it?" The sergeant beside him narrowed his eyes. "It's an ogre, one of the mountain bastards." "Butlone?" "Worse," the sergeant muttered. "A Maneater." They watched as Grogmaw came to a halt just 10 paces from the gate. He stared up at the walls, unblinking, unmoving. A wet gust of wind whipped at his furs and carried the scent of steel, blood, and wet leather. Below, a cluster of Dregmouth's gate guards slowly emerged, swords half-drawn, halberds raised. "State your name and business," the lead guard called out, voice shaking as he tried to puff himself up. "This ain't a bloody zoo, ogre." Silence. Grogmaw blinked once. Then, without a word, he reached into a leather pouch and pulled free a scrap of parchment, crumpled, soaked, and stamped with the seal of the Altdorf mercenary registry. It bore one word, scrawled in thick charcoal. "Work." He held it out. The guard took a cautious step forward, then another. Snatching the note, he read it, cursed, then squinted up. "You got coin?" Grogmaw grunted once, a deep, bassy sound like gravel shifting in a pit. He reached into another pouch and pulled out a small sack. It jingled. The gates creaked open. And like that, Grogmaw entered Dregmouth. He passed beneath the archway, and the guards flinched as he came close. His scent hit them, smoke, blood, iron, and the unmistakable stink of something that survived too long in too many bad places. He walked slow, deliberate, each step squelched in the muck. Children peeked from behind doors. An old woman spat and crossed herself. A dog barked and then fled. No words, no eye contact, just observation. The ogre turned onto the main road, moving through the town like a walking landslide. He passed fishmongers and drunkards, watched 2 pickpockets scurry away, and listened to a toothless preacher scream at the sky. He didn't understand their gods, but he watched how they begged them. At the far end of the road, nestled between a shipwright's yard and a crumbling chapel, hung a wooden sign. The Salted Pike. A tavern. Loud, alive, the smell of sweat, beer, and desperation. He stepped inside. The room fell silent. Chairs scraped, mugs froze mid-air. A burly sailor reached for a dagger. Grogmaw did not flinch. He moved to the bar and stopped. Rain dripped from him in fat puddles. His hooked spear thunked as he leaned it against the counter. The barkeep, a one-eyed man with a beard full of breadcrumbs, stared. "You here to drink or kill?" Grogmaw looked around. Saw a bruiser near the door pin a wench to the wall. Saw a pair of gamblers throw dice with knives between their boots. saw the flickers of fear behind their bravado. He tapped the bar with one meaty finger, then pointed at the thug by the girl. The barkeep blinked. "You want to?" Grogmaw didn't wait. In 2 strides he crossed the room. The thug turned, grinning, until a tree-trunk forearm lifted him clean off the floor and slammed him through a table. Wood exploded, tankards flew, the tavern erupted into shouting. The thug lay twitching, arm bent backward, jaw slack. Grogmaw turned, looked at the barkeep. The one-eyed man grinned. "Job's yours, Ogre." Outside, the rain poured. Inside, the patrons slowly returned to their drinks. And Grogmaw, stoic and soaked, took a seat in the corner, watching. Always watching. Chapter 2. Coin for the Quiet Giant. The salted pike stank of brine, blood, and sour ale. It was the kind of place where sailors pissed in corners, barmaids kept daggers in their bodices, and smiles were as fake as coin in a rogue's purse. The kind of place where people disappeared. And no one asked how. But tonight, the mood had changed. The ogre had claimed a corner table. Grogmaw sat in silence, hulking over a meal of charred beef and bread that could chip teeth. His cleaver rested beside his plate, its edge flecked with dried gore. His spear stood like a banner beside him. The rain outside drummed a constant war beat against the shutters, but no one dared speak louder than a whisper near the ogre. Even the usual rowdy drunks now drank quietly. Dice rolled softer. Fights paused. He was a mountain hunched over a plate, and the townsfolk treated him like one. You don't yell at a landslide. You wait for it to pass. Behind the bar, Jarl Venz watched. Jarl was thick-necked, one-eyed, and scarred from his years at sea. The pike was his last ship, a fixed one of timber and flame, and he ran it like a captain with a mutinous crew. But Grogmaw, he was a leviathan beached at his door. When the ogre had broken that thug's spine without a word, Jarl knew. This wasn't just muscle. This was discipline. Rare, precious, dangerous. As the bar began to thin, Jarl cleaned a chipped mug and approached. "You eat like you mean it," he said, voice rough. Grogmaw didn't look up. "You break bones like you were born for it." Still no reply, just chewing. "I got a job, one you already started." Grogmaw paused. His eyes, small, sharp, cold, lifted to meet the man's. Jarl didn't flinch, but he felt the weight behind that stare. Not just mass. Thought. "I pay in coin, food, and no questions," Jarl said. "You keep the scum from killing each other or bleeding out on my floor. You don't touch the girls. You throw out the ones who do. You don't start fights, but you finish them." The ogre swallowed, then nodded once. Final. Iron. Jarl grinned. "Done. You're hired." And just like that, Grogmaw became the salted pike's shield. The days that followed taught him more about humans than months on the road ever had. He stood silent at the door, looming behind patrons like a shadow with teeth. He watched, he listened, he learned. They were loud, so loud. Humans barked, bragged, begged, cried, laughed, and threatened in the same breath. They were fragile, bones snapped easy, skin tore like parchment, but they never stopped. That fascinated him. One night, a grizzled whaler came in with a face like spoiled ham and fists full of bruises. He tried to shove a girl against a wall. Grogmaw moved with silent rage. He grabbed the man by the ankle and slammed him into the wall once, twice, 3 times, until the timber cracked and teeth flew like dice. The patrons watched in awe as the ogre tossed the man outside like garbage, then returned to his corner. Another time a gambler tried to knife a merchant mid-roll. Grogmaw snapped the man's wrist with 2 fingers, then shoved the blade into the table, driving it straight through the wood with one hammer fist. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Even Jarl started calling him the the quiet giant. At night, Grogmaw sat by the fire and studied the people. He watched a blind lute player pluck trembling notes for copper. He watched a mother drink herself sick while her boy slept under the table. He watched an old knight turned drunkard cry into his mug, whispering apologies to ghosts. He didn't understand their pain, but he respected it. In the mountains of Morn, pain was simple. Hunger, cold, the blade. Here it was layered, complex, hidden behind eyes and forced smiles. Some nights, Grogmaw stood outside, watching the waves crash against the docks. He remembered stories of elven ships and sea dragons. He wondered if the ocean had a gut plate, deep, scarred, ancient. He imagined the deep as a rival, and he respected it too. But he also noticed the dark tide rising. Fewer ships came in. The ones that did were half-burned or limping. Sailors whispered of shadows that moved faster than wind, of ships vanishing beneath black clouds. Fish grew scarce. The mood soured. One night a dying man stumbled into the pike, salt-scarred, eyes wide, screaming about black sails and bleeding skies. Grogmaw caught him before he fell. The man died in his arms. And in that moment, the ogre felt it. A war was coming. Not like the ones he'd seen in the mountains, where tribes smashed skulls for meat. This war had intent, precision, cruelty. He'd fought monsters, but he'd never fought elves. Not yet. Chapter 3. The Stink of Fear. The salted pike, once a chorus of slurred curses and shattered mugs, had grown quiet. Not silent, no, there was still dice thrown, whores laughing too loud, and a few drunkards trying to outshout the dread. But the edge was different now. The noise had a forced air to it, like a laugh made at a funeral. Even Grogmaw felt it. It wasn't in the sound, it was in the smell. Fear had a stink all its own, like wet copper and old piss, sour and clinging, and it clung to the pike now, thick as smoke. Jarl Vence poured himself a bitter black ale and leaned across the bar toward Grogmaw. 3 ships, Groggy, he muttered, voice low. Gone, just like that. No fires spotted, no wreckage drifted back. Gone like fog at dawn. Grogmaw stood unmoving at the door, arms folded like iron timbers across his chest. He didn't blink, just stared past the rain-slicked window into the harbor beyond, where only 2 ships remained, and even they looked nervous. Ropes creaked like they wanted to flee. Jarl continued. Folks say it's the Drukei, dark elves from Nagaroth, slavers, skin-flayers. They take the living and leave behind just parts. He took a long, slow drink. Had a dockhand stumble in this morning. Said he saw a shadow walk across the water. Walk, not sail, not swim. The ogre said nothing. Jarl shook his head. I've seen storms, lad. I've fought beastmen and worse in the Reichwald. But this smells wrong. Feels wrong. And Grogmaw agreed. That night the tavern swelled with strangers, cold-eyed mercenaries, mud-streaked fishermen, red-handed smugglers, all crammed into the pike, drinking cheap spirits like it was their last night alive. Whispers drifted between tables like spiders. Saw black sails off Scorch Point Rock. No one's seen the Briar's End since last week. They say they sew eyes shut while you're still breathing. Heard they keep the children alive longest. Every tale darker than the last. Every rumor closer to the truth. You could see it on their faces, the tight jaws, the darting glances, the quick hands to blades. Fear turned men into animals, and animals turned violent. When the brawl broke out, it wasn't a surprise. A pair of rivermen had wagered over dice. One accused the other of cheating. The cheated one denied it. Then came the insult, the spit, the knife. Steel flashed. The gambler's hand went first. Grogmaw's spearhead sheared it off at the wrist before the blade could fall. Blood sprayed across the table, soaking the dice mid-roll. The man howled, staggering back, clutching the stump. Grogmaw moved like a landslide. He didn't shout. He didn't warn. He crushed the attacker's leg with a single downward stomp. Bone burst through shin, and the man collapsed, screaming. Then he grabbed the second by the back of his neck and slammed him into the floorboards with enough force to knock his eye from its socket. It dangled, trembling, as the man writhed. The tavern went dead quiet. Even the whores stopped moving. Blood dripped from Grogmaw's spear. The gambler moaned weakly, twitching in a growing puddle. The ogre didn't blink, didn't breathe fast, just stared down at them. Weak, he finally muttered, the word like thunder in a room of silence. Later, Jarl had the bodies dragged out, one dead, the other soon to be. The pike's floor still glistened red in the candlelight. The patrons drank quieter than ever, but still the whispers came. That the Druki would strike the town in the dark, that no wall, no gate, no ogre, no Sigmar-damned army could stop them. And Grogmaw? He stood by the fire now, polishing his cleaver, watching, listening, learning. He had seen beasts, monsters, warlords, trolls, but never fear like this. And fear, he thought, made fine kindling. Chapter 4. Tavern Brawls and Broken Bones. The salty pike never slept. By dusk, the air thickened with the stench of beer sweat, unwashed bodies, and stale vomit. Mismatched sailors roared sea shanties with broken teeth and crooked smiles. Thieves watched each other over mugs of watered-down ale. Dock workers growled over gambling debts. Smoke from cheap pipe leaf curled in the rafters like ghosts refusing to leave. But the brawls were inevitable, and so was Grogmaw. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't shout or brandish weapons. He didn't need to. He just stood there, near the fire or the bar, like a statue carved from storm-worn stone, gut plate glinting in the lamplight, spear resting against one broad shoulder. His cleaver stayed strapped to his back, rarely used. Most fights didn't deserve it. The pike's patrons had started calling him the Wall, because when the violence began, that's exactly what he became. The screaming sailor. It started with a bottle. A sailor from Marienburg, drunk, sun-scarred, red-faced, smashed a bottle across another man's cheek after losing a hand of cards. Glass exploded. Blood sprayed the table. Screams rose. The room spun into chaos. Chairs flipped. Blades flashed. Grogmaw moved. 1 step. 2. Then a sailor rushed him with a broken table leg, yelling something unintelligible. Grogmaw ducked the swing, drove one hand into the man's chest, and lifted. The sailor hit the ceiling beam with a crack of ribs, then came down on a table, crunching through it like wet bark. Teeth scattered. No one moved to help him. The ogre turned his gaze toward the others. The fight ended. The knife men from Nordland. 2 nights later, a thin man with beady eyes tried to knife a whore in a back booth. Thought no one would notice in the noise, but Grogmaw heard the whisper of steel and the scream before it escaped the girl's throat. He crossed the room like thunder. The man turned, blade raised. Too slow. Grogmaw caught his wrist mid-swing, crushed it until bones snapped like kindling, then dragged him across the bar floor like a child pulling a sack. The man kicked, shrieked, begged. Outside, Grogmaw flung him into the mud. The man tried to crawl. The ogre stepped on his leg with one massive foot, snap. Then he went back inside. Didn't speak, didn't smile. Just nodded to the girl, who stared at him like a saint made of stone. The Bludgeon Brothers. Word spread fast. Some tried to test the giant. 3 dock thugs came in one night, drunk on smuggled Kislevite spirits, laughing loud and spitting on the floor. Big lads, used to breaking backs for coin. They surrounded Grogmaw, called him names, mocked his silence. One threw a punch, and that was the mistake. Grogmaw caught the fist in midair, twisted, and shattered the elbow backwards, a wet crack that silenced the room. The second one lunged. Grogmaw sidestepped and headbutted him in the temple. The man crumpled like meat dropped from a butcher's hook. The third hesitated, then ran. Grogmaw didn't follow. He simply picked up a splintered bar stool and sat back down. The salted pike changed after that. Not quieter, but smarter. Violence still happened. This was Dregmouth after all, but now it came with risk. The kind that broke arms, crushed legs, and smeared teeth into the floorboards. And Grogmaw, he never boasted, never grinned, never struck first. But when the storm came, he was the thunder at its heart. Jarl Vens would lean behind the bar some nights, watching the ogre return to his corner, blood on his boots and not a drop on his face, and mutter, "Better than 10 guards, that one, and half the talk." But outside the pike, in the alleys and docks, the real storm was drawing closer. Dark sails were said to be spotted again, this time closer. Soon, it wouldn't be broken teeth and drunks. Soon, it would be war. And the quiet giant would have to do more than break bones. He'd have to kill. Chapter 5. A Storm on the Horizon. The dawn sky bled rust-red across the gray waters of Dregmouth's Bay, the color of spilled wine on old steel. The wind smelled of salt and rot, thicker than usual. Wrong. The gulls didn't scream that morning. They circled in silence, unease stitched into the clouds like a promise. Then came the bell. Clang, clang, clang. The warning bell atop the port tower rang thrice, slow and deliberate, not the usual droning for storms or fire. This toll was older, darker. Enemy sails. Jarl Vens burst into the Salted Pike's common room, panting, soaked in cold sweat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every drunkard, mercenary, and serving girl froze as his single eye met the ogre's. "They're here," he rasped. The docks were already chaos. Militiamen in rust-pocked breastplates jogged to position, crossbows slung on their backs, half-dressed and hung over. Fishmongers pulled nets from the piers, dropping gut-slick baskets as they fled inland. Ship crews scrambled to untie moorings, desperate to escape, cursing the harbor chains locking their vessels in place by order of the portmaster. And there, past the fog line, it waited. One ship. Enormous. Its hull was obsidian black, carved like bone, ribs exposed between warped planks that creaked without wind. Its sails drooped like skin flayed from a corpse, swaying with unnatural rhythm. The figurehead wasn't a mermaid or angel, it was a twisted elf skull, eyes glittering with inlaid emeralds that seemed to watch. A Druki black arc raider. A killer of coastal towns, a ghost ship carrying corsairs, witches, beasts. No one knew exactly how many it held. Enough. Too many. Grogmaw stood at the edge of the pier, spear in hand, watching the ship drift forward like a predator sizing up its prey. He didn't blink. He didn't move. The wind tore at his furs, howled past his gut plate, hissed across his cleaver's hilt. Rain began to fall, slow, fat drops at first, then steady, cold as a grave. Behind him, Captain Earnhardt of the watch barked orders, trying to organize the town guard into a line. Shields clattered, boots slipped, crossbow strings were checked and rechecked by shaking hands. "They'll strike tonight," someone muttered near Grogmaw. "Always strike under darkness." "Don't they ever speak?" another asked. "Or scream?" "No," an older man said quietly. "But you will." The ogre's gaze never left the black ship. He studied the motion of it, the way it didn't slice through the sea but glided, like oil over skin. He watched the shadows that shifted along the deck, tall life figures wrapped in barbed armor and cloaks that fluttered, though no wind blew there. Drukai. He remembered stories from Thailand sellswords in the Border Princes. Stories of raiders who skinned men alive and used their hides to bind their spellbooks. Of witch elves who danced through war lines naked, drenched in blood not their own. Of monsters that moved like men but screamed like nothing born of this world. Grogmaw didn't know if those tales were truth or terror, but he knew the smell was real. He inhaled slowly. Deep blood, steel, fear, and something else, an acrid, burning musk that didn't belong to man or beast. The scent of dark magic. As the sun crawled across the sky behind iron clouds, the black ship drifted closer but never docked. It simply lingered, watching, measuring, a silent threat. And by nightfall, Dregmouth had changed. Shutters were nailed closed, lanterns dimmed. The streets emptied. The salted pike became a fortress of its own. Doors bolted, barrels piled near windows. Jarl passed out crossbows and flasks of stiff liquor. Even the whores carried blades now. Grogmaw remained at the docks, unmoving until twilight drowned the bay in shadow. When he returned to the tavern, dripping, his cleaver rested unslung on his shoulder. He didn't say a word, but everyone who saw him knew. War had come. Chapter 6. Blood on the Tides. The raid began with no warning. No horns, no calls, no taunts. Just a scream, high, sharp, cut short mid-breath. Then another. And then chaos. Night had wrapped Dregmouth in damp, cloying silence. Mist poured over the docks like ghost breath. Lanterns flickered in the gloom, casting distorted shadows across the warped boards of the pier. And then the shadows moved. They came from the sea. Long, sleek skiffs, black wood, silent oars, glided through the harbor like slithering eels. Not a splash, not a word. One moment the waters were empty, the next they were full of death. Druki corsairs vaulted over rails in armor that clung like second skin, blades curved like predator fangs. Their eyes gleamed behind slitted masks, and their mouths split into grins that promised torment. Witch elves came with them, bare, blood-slick, teeth bared in ecstasy. Their blades weren't for killing, but artistry, long, thin, and cruelly serrated. They danced across the docks, laughter like nails scraping bone. Grogmaw had been waiting. He stood beneath the rusted bell tower, rain beating on his gutplate, spear in hand, cleaver on his back. When the first corsair lunged from the shadows, he was ready. The elf came fast, too fast for a man to block. But Grogmaw wasn't a man. He moved with sudden, impossible precision, his spear lancing through the elf's gut mid-leap. The corsair choked on black blood as he slid down the haft, legs twitching. Grogmaw lifted him like a banner and hurled the body into the harbor with a meaty splash. Then turned. The docks were alight with screams. Town guards tried to form ranks, but the Druchi cut through them like water. Crossbow bolts were deflected by curved blades. Helmets split, limbs flew. A guard cried out for his mother as his entrails spilled into the tide. A witch elf cartwheeled through the melee, her blades singing, her body slick with rain and gore. She landed on a crate near Grogmaw, grinning wide, and lunged. She was a blur of flesh and silver. Grogmaw barely caught her first strike with his spear shaft. Metal screeched as sparks flew. She spun, slicing at his ribs, and carved a shallow gash across his side. He grunted, not from pain, but surprise. Fast, too fast for brute force. He shifted his stance, dropped low, and swung the butt of the spear like a hammer. It cracked into her knee with a sound like snapped branches. She shrieked, staggered, and he grabbed her by the throat with one massive hand. He lifted her. Her eyes bulged. She slashed his arm twice, thrice, drawing deep gashes. But Grogmaw didn't let go. Instead, he squeezed. There was a crunch, then silence. He let her fall. All around, the docks were burning. Flames licked at crates, ropes, and tar-slicked wood. Smoke mixed with salt, the air thick with screams and the moaning of the wounded. Grogmaw saw 3 corsairs overwhelming a guard. One stabbed him in the gut, another drove a blade through his back, the third sliced the dying man's face open, watching with glee as he twitched. The ogre charged. His cleaver came free from his back with a screech of metal. He swung. Crunch. The first corsair went down, his spine cleaved in half. The second turned, mouth open, but Grogmaw backhanded him with the flat of the blade, shattering his jaw and sending him flipping over the dock rail. The last corsair tried to run. Grogmaw hurled his hooked spear. It pierced the elf's back and dragged him to the ground like a fish on a line. He squirmed, hissing curses in Eltherin. Grogmaw walked over, and with one heavy stomp ended him. But for every Druki he felled, 2 more swarmed. He wasn't used to foes like these, so fast, so precise, so utterly without fear. They didn't charge like beastmen. They cut. They struck from the shadows, vanished, then returned for the kill, and worse, their blades carried poisons. His arms burned, his side ached. He was bleeding. He hadn't bled in months. And yet he stood. The tide rolled in dark and endless, black shapes flitting between flames. The harbor groaned under weight of battle, the sea lapping hungrily at the blood that soaked the planks. And at the heart of it all, Grogmaw stood alone, battered, bloodied, breathing hard, but unbowed. He looked out at the bay. The Black Ark ship hadn't moved. It watched, waiting. This wasn't their full force. This was just a taste. And Grogmaw knew, next time, they wouldn't come to raid. They would come to erase. Chapter 7. Broken shields, broken spirits. The rain didn't stop the fires. Through smoke-choked streets, Dregmouth burned. The Druchi had struck without pause. After the docks, they spread like poison through the alleys, their blades flashing under the flickering light of flames. Bodies littered the cobbles, guards in torn mail, merchants with slit throats, and beggars with their ribs opened like fish. The salted pike was no exception. The Grogmaw arrived just as the first floor erupted, flames curling from the windows like devilish fingers. Jarl Ven stood at the threshold, blood pouring from a cut across his face, waving a handkerchief like a signal flag. Inside, screams. "The girls, the bloody girls are still in there," Jarl bellowed, staggering. Grogmaw didn't hesitate. Through fire. He smashed through the door, wood shattering beneath his shoulder. Heat hit him like a hammer, but he pressed on, cleaver unslung. The pike was an inferno, tables ablaze, rafters crackling. A burning corpse swung from the second floor, tangled in a chandelier. In the corner, 2 serving girls huddled, trapped behind a fallen beam. Without words, Grogmaw grabbed the beam's base and heaved, muscles straining as the wood cracked and lifted. Flames licked at his arms, his furs smoldered, his skin blistered, but still he held. "Go," he growled, deep and guttural. They scrambled free, tears streaking soot-stained faces. As Grogmaw released the beam, the second floor collapsed, crushing the room behind him. He turned and strode through the fire, cleaver dragging sparks along the floor. When he emerged, smoke billowing from his armor, the crowd outside gasped. One girl clung to him, unconscious. The other followed, coughing but alive. Jarl nearly collapsed. "Sigmar, save us!" But it wasn't over. A town shattered. The streets were worse. Refugees crowded the alleys, dragging wounded kin, clutching children, carrying nothing but what they could grab before the flames swallowed their homes. The guards, those that lived, were broken, bloodied, and outnumbered. Their formation crumbled under constant harassment. Corsairs darted through the smoke like jackals, cutting down stragglers, pulling the weak into the fog. A young watchman fell before Grogmaw, a jagged blade lodged deep in his thigh. He reached out, fingers shaking. Without a word, Grogmaw scooped him up under one arm. More followed, 3 townsfolk too weak to run, a child too small to carry a weapon, an old priest bleeding from the eyes, poisoned. Grogmaw bore them all through the maze of collapsing streets. Corsairs tried to cut him off. One leapt from a window. Too slow. Grogmaw swung the unconscious watchman like a club, crushing the elf's head against a wall in a spray of bone and blood. He didn't stop walking. Another struck from behind. Grogmaw spun, backhanded the corsair into a burning wagon and trudged on. The temple square. By night's peak, the remaining survivors gathered in the old temple square. Cracked statues of Sigmar loomed, blackened by smoke. Makeshift barricades rose, wagons, barrels, whatever wasn't already burning. Refugees huddled together, some clutching knives, others with bare fists and terrified eyes. Jarlvens, leaning on a broken halberd, staggered to Grogmaw's side. Half the guards dead. The docks are ash. The pike's gone. He turned to Grogmaw, voice cracking. You could leave. Nothing's holding you here. Why stay? Grogmaw looked at the people, the child clinging to his leg, the priest gasping prayers, the battered guards still trying to stand. He simply adjusted his gut plate and turned to face the smoke-filled streets. No words, only purpose. The Druchi were not done, and neither was he. Chapter 8. The Price of Silence. The fires burned for 3 days. Black smoke coiled into the gray skies, thick enough to choke the gods themselves. Charred beams jutted from ruins like broken ribs. Corpses floated belly up in the harbor, feeding gulls fat on ruin. Dregmouth was dying. Yet, as the flames faded and the screams quieted, the people began to notice something peculiar. The ogre had never left. A monster still standing. By the 4th morning, Grogmaw stood alone atop the crumbled remains of the salted pike. His armor was scorched, his gut plate tarnished. His left arm, thick as a ship's mast, was wrapped in torn sailcloth, bleeding sluggishly. Yet he stood, motionless, watching the docks like a sentinel of stone. The people avoided him at first. Then, one by one, they approached. A fisherman with a missing ear and blood-caked beard limped forward, head low. "You saved me, boy," he said, voice cracking. "Don't know why, but thank you." The ogre said nothing, only blinked. The fisherman left without further word. But he wasn't the last. The talisman. That evening, as the storm clouds broke and golden slashes of sun speared through the smoke, a small child emerged from the rubble, a girl, barefoot, clothes tattered. She approached without fear. No one dared stop her. She carried something clutched tightly in her tiny hand, a crude, handmade talisman fashioned from twine, sea glass, and carved driftwood, shaped like a crude bull's head, the mark of the old harbor folk. She stood before Grogmaw, craning her neck to meet his eyes. Her lip trembled. This is for you." Grogmaw's massive hands slowly extended. The girl placed the talisman in his palm, her small fingers brushing against his calloused skin. It was warm, human. For a long breath he said nothing. Then, with unmatched care, he tied it to the cracked leather strap on his gut plate. No smile, no thanks. But the girl nodded as if she understood, then ran back to the crowd, vanishing behind grieving mothers and armed men too afraid to admit they were crying. The priest's blessing. By nightfall, as the survivors huddled in the temple square beneath shattered statues, the old priest approached. He was bent, draped in burnt and blood-stained robes, eyes heavy with grief. In his shaking hands he carried a rusted censer still puffing the faint scent of herbs. "Giant," the priest said, voice barely audible, "I know not your gods, or if you have any at all, but you have the strength of Sigmar's arm." He made the sign of the twin-tailed comet with slow, deliberate fingers. Then he gently pressed 2 fingers against Grogmaw's brow. "I bless you," the old man said. The ogre didn't move, didn't resist. He simply stood there as incense curled around him. The priest's touch lingered just long enough to leave a faint red smear on Grogmaw's scarred skin. It wasn't a proper blessing, but it was all he had, and Grogmaw accepted it. The silence broken? Later that night, as he watched over the people huddled by the cold remains of the temple bonfire, Jarl Ven slumped beside him. "Never thought I'd say this," Jarl murmured, staring at the broken skyline. "But you're the only reason there's still a town to call Dregmouth." He glanced sideways. "Never seen you asked for nothing, not coin, not praise." He shook his head. "You're an odd one, ogre." Grogmaw's response was only a low grunt, but behind his cold eyes something shifted. The talisman swayed gently against his gut plate in the breeze. It wasn't payment. It wasn't coin. It was worth more. And in the mist, beyond the ruined harbor, far beyond the reach of watchful eyes, the black arc still lingered. Yuan moved, unfazed. Wait, the storm wasn't over. It was just catching its breath. Chapter 9. Duel beneath the moon. The air that night was thin and sharp, biting through even the thickest cloaks. The shattered docks groaned beneath the weight of wind and the lapping of black waves. The fires of Dregmouth had died down, leaving the town bathed only in moonlight, pale and unforgiving. And under that cold gaze they came. Out of the fog, a single skiff glided silently to the ruined docks. It carried no raiding party, no host. Just one. A towering drucky clad in barbed black iron plate stepped ashore, every movement sharp as a knife drawn slowly. His helmet bore a crown of flared blades. His gauntlets were crowned with hooked talons. His twin swords glinted silver bull under the moonlight, etched with runes that bled a faint, sickly glow. The champion. Whispers spread among the survivors still huddled in the temple square. "McOrdered, Captain." "No, he's something worse." "Which can?" "An executioner." Grogmaw stepped forward. No words. No challenge spoken. The ogre knew, and so did the Druchii. The duel. They faced each other in the mud and blood-stained square, ringed by broken souls and shattered barricades. Refugees, guards, and mercenaries alike dared not interfere. The Druchii paced slowly, blades tracing lazy arcs in the air. His steps were elegant, almost delicate. Grogmaw stood still, spear held in both hands. The Druchii moved first. He exploded forward with supernatural speed, twin blades lashing like serpent fangs. Grogmaw barely deflected the first strike, metal screeching as the spear shaft met curved steel. The second blade slipped past, carving a deep gash along Grogmaw's arm, spraying hot blood into the cold night. The ogre snarled, low and guttural. The Druchii only smiled. They circled. Again the elf struck, low this time, feinting, aiming for Grogmaw's belly. The ogre twisted, catching the blade's edge on his gut plate with a heavy clang. But the second sword came fast and cracked against his gut plate hard enough to dent the steel. It hurt, more than he'd expected. The champion fought like no man or beast Grogmaw had faced, fluid, precise, utterly without waste. He didn't roar, he didn't bellow, he fought like a ritual, every step, every strike, calculated. But Grogmaw had learned too. He wasn't just a brute. He was a Maneater, blood and iron. When the elf lunged again, Grogmaw shifted his weight, deliberately letting the first blade pierce his shoulder. He grunted, blood spurting, but his free hand lashed out like a battering ram and smashed the champion's helmet clean off. The Druchii staggered back, exposed. His face was angular, cruelly beautiful, eyes cold as polar steel. For the first time his smile faded. Grogmaw pulled the blade free from his shoulder and, with a furious step forward, swung the spear like a club. The elf ducked, but the haft still clipped him, cracking ribs audibly. The elf retaliated, spinning low, blade biting into Grogmaw's thigh. The ogre stumbled. The Druchii struck again, this time both blades crossing over and driving into Grogmaw's gut plate, cracking the iron and denting it inward. Sparks flew. Grogmaw staggered, falling to one knee. The elf's eyes gleamed. Victory. But Grogmaw's hands were still on the spear. With a grunt he drove it upward, hooking beneath the Druchii's ribs. The champion gasped. Then, with a mighty heave, Grogmaw lifted the elf into the air, and then slammed him down with enough force to splinter the flagstones beneath them. The Druchii writhed, swords lust. Grogmaw didn't give him a second. He brought the butt of the spear down onto the elf's face, once, twice, 3 times, until bone gave way and the head was no more than a ruin of blood and teeth. The square went silent. Only the ragged panting of the ogre remained. The aftermath. Grogmaw stood, swaying slightly, blood pouring freely from his wounds. His gut plate was cracked down the center. His left arm shook. But he stood. And the townsfolk? They stared. In fear. In awe. In hope. Jarl Vens whispered from the crowd, "Sigmar preserve, he killed it." The ogre said nothing. Later, alone by the ruined docks, Grogmaw sat by the firelight and used the Druchii's own dagger to etch new runes into his gut plate, scarred now, but not broken. Each rune marked not a boast, but a lesson, a memory, a reminder. He bled as he carved, and he did not flinch. The storm had not passed, but Grogmaw was ready. Chapter 10. A Plan of Fire and Steel. The black sails were still on the horizon. The Druchii had retreated, but not vanished. Their ships lingered just beyond the fog, silent, patient. A predator's patience. Inside Dregmouth, amidst the ashes and blood, the survivors stood on the razor's edge. Not broken, but close. The burned remnants of the salted pike became the rallying point. Jarl Vens, wrapped in blood-stained bandages, stood beside the old priest, Captain Earnhardt, and the scowling masters of the merchant guilds. Hardened fishermen, scarred smugglers, aging guards, even dockhands too young to shave, all gathered. And they all turned to Grogmaw. A different kind of strength. "You saw it?" Jarl said hoarsely. "We can't stop them. Not with what we are." The guildmaster grunted, thumbing a bloodied axe. Half-trained militia, half of them drunk, the other half too scared to piss straight. "But," the old priest added, voice calm, "we have him." All eyes turned to Grogmaw, who stood silently at the base of the ruined altar, the cracked gut plate still fresh with carved runes, his cleaver slung across his back like a looming threat. His left arm was crudely stitched, but he stood straight. Jarl stepped forward. "We're not asking you to lead. We know you ain't one for speeches." He nodded at the gathered men and women. "But if you'll show us how to stand, how to make these bastards pay?" The crowd murmured. "You'll have more than coin," Jarl finished. "You'll have a wall behind you." Grogmaw stared, then gave a single heavy nod. The ogre's way. Training began before dawn. No drills, no barks, no speeches. Grogmaw taught by doing. He stood among them, cleaver gripped, and fought. He did not hold back, not fully. He struck the shields of the guards so hard that splinters flew. He knocked 2 men sprawling with a single sweep. His presence was not that of a teacher. It was that of a storm they would have to weather. The first to stand back up was a fishwife with a broken nose and a spear. Grogmaw nodded. The second was a young smuggler missing 3 fingers. Grogmaw nodded. By the third day they were fighting together, not like soldiers but like people, with nothing left to lose. He showed them how to block with butcher's knives, how to set broken doors into barricades, how to wield harpoons like spears. He taught them to move together like pack hunters, not like individuals, to use their smallness as an advantage, to be quicker than a cleaver swing, to survive, not to look heroic. Steel and fire. The Merchant Guild opened its vaults, and old rust-pitted weapons flooded the square. Jarl repurposed barrels into makeshift shields. Carpenters reforged wagon wheels into crude pavises. A battered forge near the east wall burned night and day. Blacksmiths, beaten but unbowed, reshaped broken blades into brutal weapons. They weren't pretty. They weren't elegant. They were Dregmouth steel. Rough, ugly, sharp, and Grogmaw watched it all. He saw the fear in them, but he also saw the fight, the stubborn refusal to kneel. He had seen it once in the Mountains of Morn, when an ogre tribe refused to yield to a tyrant and chose death over dishonor. They were crushed, but they left scars. Not a leader. Grogmaw stood at the rear of every drill, never commanding, never shouting orders. But his presence was louder than words. When they faltered, he advanced, quietly but with intent. When a young militiaman tried to flee during a practice assault, Grogmaw knocked him into the mud and stood over him until the lad scrambled back to the line, ashamed but stronger. Jarl grumbled one night, watching from the ruined pike's remains. "You're not a general, ogre. You're a wall." Grogmaw said nothing. But the next morning, when he watched the townsfolk hold the line against a mock charge without scattering, something cold inside him warmed slightly. They weren't warriors. They weren't even soldiers. But behind him, they would be a wall. The Black Ark still loomed. The corsairs still circled. But now, when Grogmaw stared into the mist from the broken docks, he no longer stood alone. Chapter 11. Iron Drums and Burning Ships. The sea churned beneath a blackened sky. Thunder rolled, not from the heavens, but from the drums. Heavy, iron-skinned drums that boomed from the Black Ark like the heartbeat of some vast, monstrous god. Their rhythm was slow, deliberate, and terrible. It echoed across the bay, shaking windows and making every man, woman, and child of Dregmouth taste fear at the back of their throats. The Black Ark advanced, and behind it, like shadows given form, came the fleet. Dozens of raider ships, slender, sharp, bristling with dark sails and barbed prows. Great iron hooks dangled from their sides, swaying like pendulums. The harbor waters swelled with unnatural tides. Black sorcery hung like fog. But worse still, atop the Ark's deck, Grogmaw saw them. Hydras. 2 of them. Gigantic, bloated with muscle, each bearing 5 heads, hissing and snapping at the air. Chains of dark iron held them barely in check, and cloaked beastmasters goaded them forward with hooked whips and sorcerous lashes. Their breath came hot and heavy, steaming in the chill. In the shadows of the masts, shades moved. Drukai skirmishers, their black-clad bodies near invisible against the hull, eyes glowing faintly. The Druchi were not here to raid. They were here to conquer. The ogre's plan. Grogmaw stood over the cracked docks, his wounded arm wrapped tight, observing the advancing armada. He grunted, narrowed his eyes, and turned back to the hastily fortified harbor. The defenders waited barely 100. The Alvens, flanked by militia captains and merchant guards, grimaced. "We'll hold the walls, but they'll break us by nightfall." Grogmaw said nothing. Instead, he drew a crude sketch in the mud with the butt of his spear. Ogre tactics. He etched simple lines, choke points, kill zones, fallback trenches. Not a proper fortress, Dregmouth couldn't become one overnight, but ogres didn't build fortresses. They built meat grinders. The harbor transformed. By dusk, under Grogmaw's silent direction, the harbor was no longer a dockside, it was a trap. They cut the alleys into tight, narrow funnels, where even an elf's grace would be hindered. Fallen wagons and shipwrecked timbers were stacked to form jagged barricades, sharpened with iron spikes salvaged from the shipyards. Netting dipped with fish oil and tar was stretched between buildings, ready to be lit. Harpoons, crafted overnight by desperate smiths, were mounted on rooftops. And in the mud below, concealed pits lined with broken bottle shards and fishing hooks awaited any who charged without care. Jarl whistled. "You're meaner than a border prince siegemaster." Grogmaw only stared. The ogre did not teach them how to win a noble battle. He taught them how to survive a slaughter. Iron drums and flames. As twilight deepened, the Druchii attacked. Corsairs swarmed from the ships in swathes, black blades flashing, shrieking foul praises to their bloody-handed god. Shades slithered along rooftops, crossbows spitting poisoned bolts into the dark. But Grogmaw was ready. The defenders loosed volleys from behind their makeshift walls. Many arrows clattered uselessly against elven armor, but others struck true, sending corsairs into the mud. When the elves surged down the main road, Grogmaw's traps sprang to life. A burning barrel rolled from the hills, coated in oil, crashing into the first wave. The flames whooshed into the air, igniting the nets. Fire spiderweb between the buildings, forcing the Druchii into narrow alleys, right into Grogmaw's kill zones. Militia fighters, hiding behind wreckage, speared and butchered elves in the choke points. Desperate hands rammed harpoons into armored torsos. Townsfolk fought like cornered rats, with rage, desperation, and bloodlust. The beasts unleashed. Then came the hydras. The dock groaned as two of the monsters stepped ashore, their thick necks writhing, their heads snapping and hissing. With one swing of a head, a stone building collapsed like rotten driftwood. The defenders wavered. Grogmaw charged. He was among them in seconds, spear driving deep into the nearest hydra's neck. The beast reared back, shrieking, blood jetting like a geyser. Another head clamped down on Grogmaw's arm, teeth digging deep. He didn't flinch. With a roar, he ripped the beast's mouth apart, tearing its lower jaw clean off. But the second hydra crashed into him, hurling him into a wall. Stone cracked, blood spilled. Grogmaw stumbled to his feet, battered but upright. The militia saw it, and they rallied. They charged the wounded hydra, spears and blades plunging deep into its flanks, hacking, cutting, screaming as blood and black ichor rained down. The beast fell under a mob of desperate men and women. The other hydra hissed. The drums beat faster. The real assault had just begun. Chapter 12. Nightfall and Steelfall. The drums did not stop. They pounded through the night, turning blood and rain into a rhythm of terror. Each beat shook the battered walls of Dregmouth. Each echo sent dust from the ruined eaves. The fog, thick and heavy, crawled through the streets like something alive. When night fully swallowed the town, the Druchii came. And they came like a tide. The first wave. Screams tore through the mist as the corsairs surged. They poured over the barricades like locusts, blades flashing in the firelight. Shades skittered along rooftops, raining poisoned bolts down like stinging insects. Black iron met rusted steel as the defenders buckled under the weight of the assault. The militia, half-trained and half-mad, fought with the desperation of men who knew they would not see the sunrise. Grogmaw was already among them. The quiet giant, unleashed. Without a war cry, without a single word, Grogmaw charged. He smashed through the Druchii front ranks like a thunderclap, his cleaver rising in a wide arc. The blade bit deep into the side of a corsair, splitting him from shoulder to hip. Blood sprayed across the cobbles. Another Druchii lunged from the flank. Grogmaw turned and swung sideways, pulping the elf's helm into his skull. The corpse crumpled like wet parchment. Shades leapt down from the roofs, curved daggers flashing. Grogmaw caught one mid-air, crushing ribs beneath one meaty hand before using the elf as a blunt weapon, slamming him into another and sending both sprawling into the mud. No roars, no threats, just cold, silent butchery. And somehow that silence screamed louder than any battle horn. Steel and fire. The defenders, emboldened by the ogre's terrible momentum, surged behind him. A carpenter swung a butcher's axe into a corsair's throat. A fishwife, knuckles bloodied, battered a shade's face until it was unrecognizable. Farmers, sailors, beggars, they fought like the damned, dragging Druchii warriors down into the filth and ending them with broken bottles, shovels, and dull blades. Grogmaw pushed forward. He carved through corsairs as if they were wheat. His cleaver was red from tip to hilt. His spear had been abandoned earlier, buried deep into a shade and left behind. The elves tried to pull back, to form ranks, but Grogmaw gave them no space. He pressed them into the choke points he had designed, and the streets of Dregmouth became butchers' alleys. The dance of death. The witch elves came next. They descended like spiders, howling, leaping, blades carving lines through the rain. Their eyes were wide, their mouths split into rictus grins, tongues flicking blood from the air. One latched onto Grogmaw's back, stabbing between his plates. He grunted, then reached over his shoulder, ripped her from his flesh, and slammed her headfirst into a stone wall. Her skull broke with a wet pop. Another lunged serrated daggers slashing open the side of his neck. Blood poured, but Grogmaw didn't fall. Instead, he swung low, crushing her pelvis and sending her writhing into the mud, legs twisted at grotesque angles. He kept moving. The wall holds. Captain Earnhardt, his helm half caved, called out through broken teeth, "He's the wall! Stay behind the wall!" And they did. The defenders pressed forward behind Grogmaw. Every step the ogre took broke the Druchii lines, like waves smashing against cliffs. His silence inspired more terror than the elves' war cries. Jarl Vens, crossbow slung over one shoulder, dragged a wounded lad behind the ogre's wake. "Go on, you bastards!" he spat, blood in his beard. "Follow the big bastard! Follow the wall!" The people roared. For once they roared louder than the corsairs. The night was not done. Overhead, the blackened clouds parted for a heartbeat. The moon revealed the full horror. More ships, more corsairs, and the looming bulk of the Black Ark, creeping forward inch by inch. The Druchii were not retreating. They were probing. The real assault was yet to come, and Grogmaw knew it. His cleaver, drenched in elf blood, hung heavy. His breath came slow and hard, but his footing was firm. The wall was still standing, and behind him, Dregmouth stood a little taller. Chapter 13. The Collapse Within. The walls of Dregmouth bled. As dawn threatened to break through the ashen sky, the battered defenders dared to hope. The corsairs had retreated to their black-sailed ships under the cover of night, leaving behind only corpses and blood-soaked streets. Jarl Vens and Captain Earnhardt began to speak of endurance. The people, bruised and bloodied, believed the wall still held. But they had all forgotten the oldest threat. Greed, the false friend. Guildmaster Lordrin Crane, master of the merchant syndicate, stood in the shadows of the eastern gate tower, wringing his gloved hands. His silken doublet, still clean compared to the blood-caked clothes of every other survivor, shivered with every gust of wind. He held the iron key to the harbor gates, and he stared beyond the walls at the Druki emissary waiting in the fog, a robed shade with a wicked grin promising wealth, survival, and a place in the new order. Crane trembled. The sack of coin at his feet was heavy, too heavy to refuse. He inserted the key into the gate's ancient lock. The bolts snapped open. The gate creaked, then groaned, and the gates of Dregmouth opened to the wolves. The betrayal. Corsairs surged through the breach like starving dogs. Their armor was slick with black oil. Their blades flashed in the dim light. They did not scream. They grinned. By the time the first shouts rang out from the western barricades, the eastern quarter was already overrun. Fishermen were slaughtered in their homes. Old men died in their beds. Children disappeared into the fog, their shrieks short and sharp. Chaos reigned. Jarl Vens cursed as he spotted the open gate from atop the pike's ruined balcony. "Crane! That bastard! He's opened the bloody gate!" Grogmaw was already moving. The confrontation. Grogmaw smashed through the collapsing streets, trampling corpses and burning carts, following the fresh trail of blood. At the base of the eastern gate, Guildmaster Crane stood frozen, staring wide-eyed as corsairs poured past him. He thought they'd spare him. They did not. A corsair slashed him across the face, laughing as Crane shrieked and stumbled backward. Another bashed his gut with the hilt of a curved blade, sending him sprawling into the mud. Before they could finish him, Grogmaw arrived. The ogre drove his cleaver through the first corsair like a spit through meat. The elf twitched and slid off the blade. The second tried to run. Too slow. Grogmaw grabbed him by the skull and ripped him from the ground, smashing the elf into the stones until there was nothing left but crimson pulp. Then the ogre turned to Crane. The price of betrayal. Crane scrambled back, holding up a blood-stained hand. I had no choice, they promised," he stammered. Grogmaw loomed, shadow swallowing the guildmaster. "No," Crane sobbed. "I'm one of you. I was trying to save the city, they said." The ogre grabbed him by the leg and hoisted him upside down. Crane screamed. Without hesitation, Grogmaw swung him like a club into the stone gate pillar. The guildmaster's spine bent the wrong way. Bones shattered. Blood painted the cold stone. Grogmaw slammed him again and again, until all that remained was a mangled sack of broken flesh and silk. The corsairs paused mid-assault to watch, stunned. The ogre dropped what was left of Crane like refuse. The narrowing flood. The townsfolk, led by Jarl Vens and Captain Earnhardt, quickly rallied to Grogmaw's side, sealing the gate again with salvaged timbers and smashed carts. The eastern streets were lost, but the town itself, the heart of Dregmouth, held. Billy. The people gathered behind Grogmaw, staring at the ruined eastern gate. "What kind of man?" someone whispered. "He wasn't a man," another spat. "He was a traitor." Grogmaw said nothing. He simply returned to the line. And the people followed. The wall was still bleeding, but it stood. And behind it, the ogre stood taller than ever. Chapter 14. The Last Barricade. Dregmouth had become a butcher's block. Smoke poured from shattered rooftops. Blood pooled in the gutters. The eastern quarter was gone, swallowed by flames and the Druchii. What remained of the town was now little more than a ring of battered walls and a final, desperate barricade across the temple square. The last barricade. Wagons lashed together with chains and soaked in oil. Spears poked out between the gaps. Broken mast timbers and splintered beams were wedged into the mud like crude palisades. Behind it stood fewer than 100 defenders, women, children, old men, and bloodied warriors. Some held blades, others rocks. At the center stood Grogmaw. His cleaver glistened dark with blood. His cracked gut plate bore fresh scars and hastily repaired runes. He had not slept. He had not faltered. The iron tide. The Druki came like shadows breaking against the barricade. Corsairs, cloaked shades, and cruel armored beastmasters swarmed. Screams and steel clashed. The defenders buckled under the weight, but they did not break. Grogmaw held the center. He caught spears mid-thrust. He crushed skulls beneath his heel. His cleaver rose and fell in wet arcs, leaving shattered bodies in its wake. Where others would have tired, he endured. When the Hydra returned, thrashing and furious, Grogmaw was ready. As it lunged over the barricade, Grogmaw drove his cleaver straight into its gaping maw, splitting the head like an overripe melon. The beast collapsed into the mud, crushing 3 corsairs beneath its writhing corpse. Jarl Vens roared, "Hold! Behind the ogre, hold!" And somehow they did. The matriarch arrives. But the worst had yet to come. The Druki parted, and through the swirling smoke came the witch-elf matriarch. Tall, barefoot, drenched in blood, her exposed skin was scarred with runes carved deep into her flesh. A crown of serrated bone sat atop her wild black hair. In each hand she wielded ritual daggers, longer than short swords. She danced toward the barricade with no armor, no shield, only confidence. And every elf that followed her watched. This wasn't a raid anymore. This was a sacrament. A duel. The duel begins. Without a word, the matriarch leapt the barricade in a single fluid motion, landing among the defenders. They scattered like startled birds. Only Grogmaw stood. Their eyes met. No introductions. No words. Only the pact of battle. She moved like a snake. Fast, graceful, deadly. Her first strike flashed, carving a bloody line across Grogmaw's ribs. The second bite of her blade found the meat of his thigh. But he did not fall. He grunted, shifting his stance, and swung wide. She ducked beneath the cleaver, her daggers leaving more shallow wounds across his arms and side. Fast, he thought again. Faster than the champion. But not faster than the wall. Blood and blades. The matriarch circled him, slicing deep and often, letting blood spill to feed whatever dark god she whispered to. Every flick of her blade was deliberate, calculated. She wanted him to bleed out, not die quick. Grogmaw didn't give her the chance. He charged, absorbing 3 dagger strikes before grabbing her mid-dance and slamming her into the mud. She twisted like a serpent, breaking free and slicing across his jaw, leaving a flap of torn flesh hanging. He replied by swinging the cleaver low, catching her across the thigh. Bone crunched. Her dance faltered. She hissed. The crowd of corsairs gasped, and the defenders dared to cheer. The killing blow. But the matriarch was not done. She lunged, one dagger plunging into Grogmaw's gut plate, the other piercing his side. He roared, the first sound he had made all battle. It was not fear. It was fury. His free hand caught her arm. His cleaver rose, and it fell. Crunch. It severed her from shoulder to hip in a diagonal cleave, blood and bone spraying across the barricade like a slaughterhouse. Her body tumbled, twitching. The corsairs froze. The defenders screamed, not in fear, but in defiance. Jarl Vens cried out, "The witch is dead! They can bleed!" And the town surged forward behind the ogre. The aftermath. The Druki wavered. The iron tide faltered. And Grogmaw stood, bathed in blood, staring silently at the broken host before him. No words. Only the silent promise that he would not fall. Not tonight. Not ever. And behind him, Dregmouth's people held fast. Chapter 15. Fire in the fog. The sky had turned to ash. The fog that once clung to the bay now choked it, thick with smoke and the reek of burning oil. The iron drums had fallen silent. No songs, no chants, Only the brittle crackle of flame and the distant whimpering of the wounded broke the hush. Dregmouth stood, but barely. The last of the corsairs fled, scrambling back across the blood-slickened docks, hissing curses in their alien tongue as they threw ropes to the black-skinned hulls of their ships. The great hydras, chained and wounded, thrashed in the shallow waters, snapping at handlers who fought to drag them aboard. The people of Dregmouth, shattered and ragged, could only watch as the fog swallowed the enemy. The black ark itself, massive beyond measure, drifted back into the mist without haste, as if it had decided that Dregmouth was no longer worth the sport. They had come for meat, but they had found stone. The burning docks. The docks were ruins. Whole sections collapsed into the harbor. Flames licked the fog, casting ghostly shapes that seemed to dance and writhe like spirits. Bodies, human and Drukei alike, floated between drifting wreckage, bloated and bloodied. Grogmaw stood at the heart of it. A colossus, soaked from head to toe in gore and smoke. His gut plate was split, his furs burned, his arms raw with cuts and gouges, yet he stood. His cleaver, notched and stained, hung loosely at his side. Every breath was a rasp. But he stood. The cost. The defenders dared not speak. Some sat in the mud, cradling the wounded or the dead. Others stared blankly into the fire, hollow-eyed and numb. Jarl Vence, leaning on a broken spear, staggered beside Grogmaw, voice hoarse. We lived." The ogre said nothing. Jarl coughed. "Not sure if it counts as victory, but by all the gods we're still here." Behind them, the last surviving guards helped erect a makeshift pyre for the fallen. Bodies were piled in silence. There were too many names, too many faces. And through it all the fog did not lift. The last Drukei, a lone shade, wounded and trailing black ichor, staggered from the smoke, dagger raised weakly. It lunged for a child searching among the debris. Grogmaw did not even look. He simply stepped, one heavy boot crushing the elf's skull into the dock's rotting boards. The defenders flinched. The child stared up, wide-eyed, before running back into the crowd. And Grogmaw returned to stillness. The silent sentinel. As night fully swallowed the ruins, the Drukei ships vanished beyond the mist. No cheers rose from Dregmouth. There was no strength for it. There was only silence. But as the flames smoldered and the blood misted in the salt air, one truth settled over the survivors. They were alive because of him. The townsfolk did not approach. They did not thank him. They simply watched as Grogmaw stood alone on the shattered docks. A battered, bloodied, smoldering wall. And for once, even the storm didn't dare speak. Chapter 16. A town reborn. Dregmouth was a Scot. A crooked, smoke-stained ruin stitched together by blood, sweat, and grief. The eastern quarter remained little more than rubble. The docks, blackened and warped, looked like the broken ribs of a drowned beast. But even so, it lived. The rebuilding. Hammers replaced the war drums. Smoke now rose from chimneys instead of pyres. Fishermen repaired nets in silence. Blacksmiths worked late into the night reforging melted nails and bent hinges. Children, many now orphans, played with sticks and rocks amid the ruins, laughter piercing the somber air like the first notes of a song long forgotten. The defenders worked beside them, broken but not beaten. Where once hopeless eyes had stared into fog and flame, now there was stubborn defiance. Not pride. Not yet. But hope. They rebuilt with what they had, shipwood, burnt stones, scraps from their own walls. The ogre in the square. Grogmaw remained. He did not return to the salted pike, nor to the shelter of the temple. He stood most days near the rebuilt docks, silent as always, watching as the town stitched itself back together. Children left offerings by his feet, crude drawings, bits of bread, small trinkets carved from driftwood. He never shooed them away. He never moved them. When a starving dog began to sleep beside him, he let it. He became, without trying, the town's silent guardian. No one dared disturb him. They feared him. But they trusted him. The offer. Weeks passed. The harbor creaked back to life. The merchant guilds returned, fewer and poorer, but still hungry for trade. Jarl Vence, now missing an eye and walking with a cane, approached Grogmaw one morning beneath the battered arch of the town gates. He held a scroll in one hand. In the other, a simple iron key. "You've bled for this place," Jarl said. "More than anyone. The council's agreed if you'll have it, land and a house, your own holding, a title even." He spat. Not that I'd put much stock in titles, but the others insisted. He gestured weakly at the battered town. "We could use a wall that doesn't crumble. Someone to keep us standing." The people behind him, survivors, widows, crippled guards, children, watched quietly, hopeful. The ogre's answer. Grogmaw stared at the key, at the faces, at the wounded still fighting to rebuild. His eyes, colder than the northern winds, softened almost imperceptibly. Then he gently closed Jarl's fingers around the key. He turned away, adjusting the cracked strap of his gut plate, and walked down the muddied main road, past the wreckage, past the people. He did not speak. He did not need to. The wall walks on. Jarl let out a slow breath. The townsfolk watched as Grogmaw disappeared into the fog-bound road eastward, alone, cleaver strapped to his back, furs trailing like a tattered banner. The dog followed a few steps, then stopped, sat, and howled softly. Grogmaw never looked back. The wall was not meant to stand forever in one place. He had more to learn, more to become. Dregmouth was reborn, but his journey was far from over. Chapter 17. The Scholar's Journal. The weeks stretched into months. Dregmouth clawed itself back from the edge like a stubborn drunk refusing to die. The walls were patched, the docks half rebuilt, and smoke once again rose from hearths instead of ruin. Trade returned slowly. Fishermen mended boats. Children filled the streets with the echoes of rough laughter. And still, whispers of the ogre echoed louder than the hammering of nails. The scribe. Varnold, a half-blind scribe with ink-stained fingers and a crooked back, had survived the siege by sheer luck, drunk and locked in his cellar. When he emerged days later, he found his town still standing, and at its center, the towering silhouette of Grogmaw. Varnold, unlike others, did not avoid the ogre. He watched him. He followed, careful but curious, scribbling on yellowed parchment with frantic energy as Grogmaw hauled stone to help rebuild the docks, broke ice on the harbor for fishers, or stood long hours simply staring eastward. Varnold spoke to anyone who would talk. Jarl, the remaining guards, the children, the old priest, and compiled their tales into a leather-bound journal. He titled it plainly, The Quiet Giant. Learning to read. Grogmaw noticed. Of course he noticed. The scribe didn't exactly hide. One evening, as the sun bled red across the bay, Varnold dared to approach Grogmaw, trembling. I wrote about you," he said, extending the journal with both hands like an offering to a beast god. Grogmaw stared down at the book. Then, slowly, with fingers thick and scarred, he took it. He could not read the elegant script. Not fully. Ogre runes were harsh, crude things, meant for tallying meat and grudges, not for words that sang like rivers. But he could make out some. Clumsy letters. Familiar names. His own. He returned to his usual place, overlooking the ruined east quarter, and sat beneath a warped, salt-stained statue. There, Under fading light, he tried, word by word, page by page, and with every halting, broken sentence, the faces of Dregmouth took form again, not just the battle, but the quiet moments. The girl who gave him the talisman, the guards who followed without orders, the screams, the silence, the endurance, the new rune. That night, beneath a brittle moon, Grogmaw took a sharpened chisel and, with one hand steady and practiced, etched, not a boast, not a kill, but a simple rune for memory. A jagged, ugly thing to any scholar. But to Grogmaw it meant more than the victories marked across his gut plate. When he finished, he stared at it for a long time, running a thumb over the fresh scar. He allowed himself the faintest grunt of satisfaction, then closed the journal and watched the stars. The scribe's gift. Days later, Varnold would find a crude but perfect carving of a bull's head left at his doorstep, marked with the same rune. He understood, and never asked for thanks. Chapter 18. Reflections in Steel. The temple stood like a battered tooth, half buried beneath the scars of Dregmouth's siege. Its great brass doors were dented, smeared with soot and blood. The twin-tailed comet above the arch had cracked, one half dangling pitifully by a rusted chain. Yet the doors still opened each dawn, and Grogmaw, ever silent, found himself drawn there, the silent giant among the devout. He entered without announcement. Heads turned, the faithful huddled in corners and under tarpaulin-patched ceilings, eyes wide at the sight of him. Children tugged on their mothers' skirts, old men stared with sunken, fearful gazes. But the priest, a wiry, aged man with robes torn and stained, simply nodded from the ruined altar. "You may sit, child," he said calmly, as if speaking to another worn fisherman and not an ogre stained with battle scars. And so Grogmaw did. He sat cross-legged on the cold, cracked floor, massive frame looming against the warped pillars like a watchful titan. His cleaver rested beside him. He did not pray. He did not kneel. He listened. The sermon. The priest's voice, hoarse yet steady, echoed through the hollow chamber. He spoke of Sigmar, of a god who was not born from fire, but from hardship, not mighty by birthright, but forged through suffering and trial. He spoke of resilience, of men and women standing against horrors beyond count, not because they could win, but because they refused to fall. To stand, the priest said, raising a frail hand, is sometimes the only act of defiance one has. The words made little sense to many. But Grogmaw? He leaned forward slightly. For the first time he did not see the people of Dregmouth as weak. He saw them as small, yes, but enduring, like stones battered by endless storm. They stood again and again, and there, in the flickering lamplight, among broken pews and ragged banners, Grogmaw felt a flicker of understanding. The reflection. After the sermon, Grogmaw rose and approached the brass altar plate, tarnished and bent. It was not meant as a mirror, but in its warped reflection he saw himself. Not just the flesh, but the cracks, the scars, the quiet will that refused to yield. His cracked gut plate, the fresh runes, the blood still dark beneath his armor, the child's talisman swaying gently from his strap. It all told a story, and he finally listened. Strength was not just steel and muscle. It was standing after being broken. It was watching others suffer and not turning away. It was fighting not for glory, but because you must. The departing. He did not speak to the priest. He did not linger for blessings. He left as silently as he entered. But before crossing the threshold, he spared one last glance at the shattered twin-tailed comet above the altar, and nodded. Outside, the chill of the wind carried with it the promise of more trials. But Grogmaw no longer walked as a warrior alone. He walked as one who understood. The lesson was not yet finished, but the words of Sigmar's priest were carved into him now, as surely as any rune. Chapter 19. Farewells at dawn. The sky was bleeding pale gold when Grogmaw prepared to leave. A weak sun broke over the fractured rooftops of Dregmouth, painting ash-covered walls in soft light, making the scars of war look almost peaceful, like old wounds that had finally stopped hurting. Smoke no longer choked the air. The bells of the rebuilt temple rang once, and the people knew the ogre was leaving. The road ready. He stood at the edge of town, near the shattered arch that once served as Dregmouth's eastern gate, now rebuilt in rough stone and scavenged timber, crooked but standing. His spear rested across his back. His cleaver was bound in cloth. A battered satchel, made from stitched sails and old armor scraps, hung from his hip. His gutplate gleamed faintly in the morning sun, cracked, scarred, etched with old runes and new ones, and adorned with the talisman the little girl had given him. It swayed gently in the breeze. He looked down the dirt road that wound through the eastern hills and vanished into the haze. Then he turned. Yalvin's. Yaul arrived first. His cane thumped unevenly against the stones, each step a growled curse against age and pain. The bruises around his remaining eye had faded, but the limp remained. He wore a thick coat and a half-chewed cigar between his teeth. "Didn't think you'd just vanish in the night like a ghost," he muttered, "though you're ugly enough for it." Grogmaw said nothing. "You saved us. Don't care what some say. If you hadn't stood that line, we'd all be flayed and floating." He exhaled thick smoke. "I ain't got speeches. Just this." He extended a hand. Not trembling, not weak. A firm grip, offered in full respect. Grogmaw looked at it, then took it. Their hands locked, one like stone, the other like old leather. No words passed between them, but both understood. The child. She came next, small, barefooted as always, but now with a patchwork scarf around her neck and soot-smudged on her cheeks. She walked slowly, carrying something in both hands. A rock, flat polished by the sea. On it she had carved in rough, childlike scratches the symbol Grogmaw had etched on his gutplate, the rune of memory. She held it up to him, eyes wide, hopeful. He knelt with a grunt, massive form lowering with care, and took the gift in his open palm. Then, with the same motion, he placed a heavy silver ring, too big for any human, into her hands, one he had taken from a corsair captain, blood still crusted inside. She gasped, then smiled. He gave a small, short nod. She ran back to the crowd watching from the square. The priest. The old priest came last, robes still frayed, a half-burned candle in his hand. His gait was slow but sure. "You never bent the knee," he said with a tired smile, "but you understood more than most." Grogmaw didn't move. The priest reached up and gently touched the ogre's brow with 2 fingers. "A quiet heart is not an empty one. May you find what you seek." Grogmaw exhaled, low and slow, then nodded, and then he walked. No fanfare, no cheers, no banners, just the thud of his boots on stone and then dirt. One step after another. A trail of footprints into the mist. The town watched in silence, those who could bear to rise from bed, those who had shared the wall, those who had only heard the stories. And as he vanished down the winding path, the wind picked up, stirring leaves and dust behind him. He never looked back. Because his road, his becoming, wasn't finished. Not yet. Chapter 20. The road beyond the mountains. The land beyond Dregmouth was cold, ancient and empty. Rolling hills turned to jagged moors, where the earth split open into deep, wind-scoured gullies, and skeletal trees reached like withered fingers toward a sky choked with gray. birds avoided this place. Even the wind, sharp and constant, carried no song. Grogmaw walked it alone. The pilgrims. He moved without haste. Each step sent small stones skittering down the path. His cleaver, newly sharpened and cleaned of the matriarch's blood, hung heavy across his back. The talisman from the child swayed gently on his gut plate, catching stray gusts. The ogre's breath plumed like smoke. His wounds, half-healed and stitched with clumsy but effective cord, ached. But he didn't falter. He had felt worse. He had survived worse. And something in the stiffness of his gait, the measured pace of his stride, spoke of a creature no longer aimless. A pilgrim, walking towards something not yet named. Signs of the old world. He passed the bones of forgotten armies, their rusted helms and shattered blades swallowed by earth and frost. He stood over a toppled cairn, its stones blackened by time and weather, and studied the crude carvings. Ogre ruins. Old ones. They spoke of a Maneater named Grolk the Fangless, who crossed this very path centuries ago. Grogmaw knelt, tracing the half-erased symbols with a thick finger. His eyes narrowed. He added a single, fresh mark beside them, his own. Not a boast. A sign that he too had walked this way. Then he moved on, becoming. As he crested a ridge, the full sweep of the mountains rose before him. The World's Edge Mountains loomed, jagged and eternal, their peaks wreathed in storm clouds. Lightning flashed behind them, illuminating their monstrous silhouettes. Snowstorms churned in their shadowed passes. And somewhere beyond them, across endless leagues of frozen rivers, beast-haunted forests, and ruined holds, lay the Mountains of Morn, his homeland. And beyond them, whatever he chose to find. The change. Grogmaw stopped for a long moment. His hands rested on the haft of his spear. His eyes scanned the horizon. He was no longer the ogre who had left his tribe out of curiosity and doubt. He carried the scars of Dregmouth, the runes of its people, and the weight of lessons learned in blood and silence. He had watched men endure. He had stood alone. He had fought for more than just food or coin. The hunger for strength still burned within him. But now, strength meant more than broken bones. It meant standing when others could not. It meant walking the path, even if it killed you. The first step. The wind howled. The storm rolled. And Grogmaw took that first step toward the mountains. Not as a braggart. Not as a lost youth. But as a Maneater. Becoming. And as the clouds swallowed him, all that remained behind was the imprint of his heavy, resolute footprints, deep and enduring. Just like him.